Dr. Kurt Fawver, who will be reading to us and speaking with us tonight. So some of you folks may know Kurt Fawver as one of our faculty members. He teaches in our writing program. Next semester he'll be teaching American literature, and if I know Kurt, I'm sure there will be some spooky selections in his American literature curriculum as well. So if you're looking for a lit course next semester, please consider signing up for Kurt's course. You might know him as a writing coach. He does work here in the Writing Center, assisting students on their writing. And certainly after today, you'll know him as an award-winning author of science fiction, fantasy, and horror fiction as well. So let me just read a little bit about Kurt here from our flyer. Kurt's stories have won or been nominated for the Shirley Jackson Award or the Bram Stoker Award, which are two of the most prestigious awards in the horror fiction genre. You can find his previously published work in venues such as Nightmare, Lightspeed, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Weird Tales, Visterion, Best New Horror, and the year's Best Weird Fiction. So he's just out there everywhere. So please do Google him and find some of his work. He's published 3 short story collections titled Forever in Pieces, The Dissolution of Small Worlds, and the forthcoming We Are Happy, We Are Doomed, as well as numerous chapbooks. So Kurt lives here in Ohio. He teaches with us here at this lovely community college. So let's welcome Kurt and hear these stories. I'm so excited. Thank you, Kurt.
All right, so I thought we would begin by just working through a little story, and then I will get into actually discussing what makes horror stories tick, what you need to create a good horror story, and at least by my opinion. And then if we have a little time afterward, I'll read something else if you would like me to, and we'll have a Q&A. So let's get started with that. This first story that I'm going to read is short. I'm going to read pretty short selections today. And it's something that I wrote for an anthology that was supposed to be about body horror. So body horror, if you don't know, is super grotesque, gruesome stuff that happens to your body. So that's what this was intended for. So the name of the story is Dermatology, Eschatology. Your doctor thinks you have hives, but you know better. Hives are supposed to be red, not blue, a fact your doctor glossed over or purposefully ignored. And you're not supposed to feel something moving on the inside of your hives, which you do. You're afraid the real problem is insects. You're afraid a 6-legged monster laid eggs under your skin, and now its larvae are burrowing out. That's what the people online told you might happen, and it feels right. Or at least more right than the doctor's diagnosis of hives, anyway. As soon as you noticed the blue bumps running up and down your arms and your chest 2 weeks ago, you took to the internet for answers. You wanted information, yes, but you also wanted to connect with other people who had similar afflictions. Misery loves company, says the old maxim, and the internet is nothing if not a congregation of sorrows. So you reached out on message boards and live chat apps and social media groups in an effort to find someone who could understand your illness. You wanted commiseration. You wanted friendship, however strangely formed. You wanted answers you could understand. That's what you received, with an entomological bonus. The people online asked for pics of your mottled skin and showed you pics of their ruined flesh in return. They mentioned flies and beetles and segmented things with razor pincers and toxic exoskeletons. They cited incidents where they had ticks suctioned to their bellies and ants latched onto their nether regions. They sent you links about egg sacs and pupa, sores and wounds. They gave you the comfort that someone out there did care, if only as a member of the same neurotic society. These were people reaching out, trying to connect with you as you were trying to connect with them. That their explanations for your bumps were a little absurd only endeared them to you further. So even though your doctor claims it's impossible, you think the potential for insect infestation is worth consideration. At least it gives you a reason to go back online and chat about your worries. When you arrive home after the doctor's visit, the movement within your blue bumps grows worse. You waste no time messaging the bug people on their message boards, their forums, their social media groups. You're looking for advice or further explanations or just a voice in the wilderness that proves you're not alone. But no one responds. You keep posting regardless. You want everyone to know the details of your appointment and your doctor's dismissive attitude. You're hoping for a little righteous anger on your behalf. While you drop messages to your new wound-obsessed acquaintances, you scratch at the bumps. The longer you wait for responses, the more your scratching gains strength and traction. You refresh apps and web pages. You check messaging programs and your email. No one responds. Soon, you're no longer scratching, but clawing, and your fingers come away from your skin slick with blood. You don't panic, surprisingly, because this is an opportunity to see what lies inside those bumps, to give the people online even more information. You rush to the bathroom, wash away the blood from your arms, and see, poking up from every torn bump, a cluster of silver wires. Insects are nowhere to be found. You touch one of the wire bundles and it reacts, sliding further out of your ragged flesh and curling itself around your finger as though of its own volition. You pull your hand away and the wire releases, but also continues to lengthen. It worms its way down the side of your arm and drops into the sink over which you're standing. There, it twitches as though conducting an electrical current. You should be horrified, but you're thinking about all the ways to tell the people online. They're going to be so fascinated. They're going to be so jealous. You can't even imagine how much conversation this new development will generate. Other exposed wires begin slinking from your body. They extend an arm's length from your bodies, twitching and flailing in midair. They seem to be seeking something, testing the surfaces with which they come in contact. Dozens of wire tendrils grow from you, wreathing you in a whipping chaos. You glance at the bathroom mirror, and you see a monster staring back. Or maybe it's a god. Then again, maybe it's just a dying animal. A wave of dizziness and nausea sweeps over you. You decide this is all too much. This is not what you bargained for exactly. It's too involved. It's too intense. Insects could be cleared up with some medications, a bit of lancing. But live wires sprouting from your skin? No one online mentioned anything like that. What if it's too much for them, too? What if there's no one to understand this particular affliction? What if it drives them away from you? What if they won't talk to you anymore? On the verge of passing out, you lie down in the middle of your bathroom. Your thoughts buzz, not like a fly or a bee, but like the sound of an overworked electrical outlet. You wish you could find some advice on your situation now more than ever. You wish you could reach out and contact someone somewhere who could lend perspective to the wire's emergence, but you don't imagine there is any such person. Still, you have to try. Somebody is out there. Somebody will care. Surely somebody will care. Head lolling to the side, you search for your computer. You don't see it. You don't see anything except the lashing of wires all around you. It mesmerizes you with intricate weaves and patterns. Kaleidoscopic would be one way to describe it. Fractal, another. And as you watch the wires, entranced and overworked in body and mind, you fade out and enter a state wider than dreams, deeper than death. And there, answers and connections and monstrosities are all irrelevant. You wake to an untuned orchestra of screams. You try to sit up, but you can't. You're held fast by a network of wires, a spider caught in its own web. As you rested, the wires continued to grow, and horribly enough, multiplied. They now sprout from every inch of your body. Every bundle of silver strands stretches into the distance, far beyond your field of vision. Some pass through the bathroom doorway. Some snake out of the broken bathroom window. A few have punched directly through the walls. The screams continue. You realize they're not inchoate, but rather simply loud and frightened. You try to isolate what they're saying. Among the fragments you pick out are, "Get it out of me, dear God, get it out! Why can I hear all this? It's going straight through my chest, straight through! They're in my neck, they're moving! How am I still alive? This should kill me! And who's that talking? Who?" You realize all at once that the voices aren't in your ears. They're in your head. They cry out in places far from your bathroom. But how? You consider the situation for a moment and come to a second, more terrible knowledge. You can hear the voices because they're connected to you through the silver wires. You concentrate, and somehow, as though through your own eyes, you see where those wires lead. You see where they puncture the screaming people, bundles of silver drilled into their flesh, leading directly from you to these frightened others. You see the shock, the awe, you see the snarling mouths and tear-spotted cheeks and fingers probing at grievous wounds, and of course you see the wires, which wrap themselves around deep organs and bore through bone and entrails and gray matter, anything that can be penetrated. No matter how deep they travel, the wires shoot back to the surface and pass out of their unwitting hosts, growing further, growing beyond, finding more bodies, more minds to infiltrate, to knit together. It's these people you hear, the people twisted up with you. You share their innermost thoughts, you pulse with their feelings. They're all connected to you, through you, a multitude. You ebb and flow as one. Thousands of people, maybe millions, lie elsewhere, impaled by the wires. They share this terror with you, united in pain and fear. You would tell them to relax, to let it happen, but you have no reason to believe this will end well. Again, you try to move, but the weight of the wires and the many lives they now support is too great. No matter how much you strain, you can't lift your arms or your legs more than a hair's breadth off the floor. How will you eat? How will you drink? Unless you can derive sustenance through these wires, this bathroom is where you will die. You wish you had your computer or your phone. The people online really need to hear about what's become of you. Alas, both remain far out of reach. You wonder when or if the wires will stop growing and puncturing new victims. Will they continue on, even with your dry, desiccated corpse at their center? Will they encircle the world and everyone in it? Even now, are they seeking people halfway around the globe, in places you've never even heard of? You laugh, imagining the ridiculousness of an apocalypse that bloomed from your skin. Dermatology, eschatology. Same difference, you think. The screams reach a greater pitch. They need to be heard. They need to talk. To you. To each other. They need to share. You laugh again. At least you found a community that truly understands your plight and can sympathize. You're sure you'll all have a great deal to discuss in the time that you have left. So, that's just a little story to start. Now, on to the main event here, which is talking about how to write a scary story. So, how do you write a scary story? Well, in order to answer that question, you really first have to consider what is a scary story? What makes a scary story different from a story that's not scary? You might think that's obvious. What scares us? It makes us feel fear. But why? Normal stories reinforce what we think we know. They teach us about a world that's understandable, and about people who live their lives with at least a tiny semblance of logic underlying their actions. On some level, normal stories, mainstream stories, they comfort us. They expand our deep conviction that everything, even tragedies and disasters and our typical human violence, can be understood through rational thought, and thereby controlled or mastered, or at very least overcome. But scary stories, horror stories, they disrupt our deep convictions about how the world and how the people in it work. Horror stories fracture our trust in normalcy, in our ability to have any power over any real aspect of our existence. They tear holes in our manufactured knowledge of how things are, quote unquote, supposed to be. When a monster, for instance, pops up in a scary story, it's there to shatter the normalcy of the world of that story. It's there to show that all is not as it seems, and we, as individuals and as the whole of humankind, are not nearly as strong or as intelligent or as in control as we always suspected. Monsters scare us because they shouldn't be. They aren't supposed to exist. And they certainly shouldn't be greater masters of reality than we are. If they do exist, if, for instance, an undead creature that flies in through your window and sucks blood out in the middle of the night really is out there somewhere, then everything we thought we knew about how the universe works, including our particular place within it, is disrupted or outright destroyed. This lack of knowledge, this lack of power, frightens us. Rightfully so. It implies that we're not in control of our lives, we're not in control of our destinies, and we are not in control of this world. It implies that we are never truly safe, no matter how we feel. It implies that the world does not revolve around us, not in the slightest. So right there is your first key to writing a scary story. Start with our world, our normal, boring old world that we think we know. It's filled with all kinds of predictability, and break what we think is normal. Write a nice average world, just like ours, and introduce something into it that causes its people, that causes the characters within it, to question whether they are really the most powerful and the most knowledgeable beings in their world. This something that you're introducing into the story is probably a monster. But it could just as easily be an abstract or unknown force, an unexpected disaster, or even a radical or completely insane idea. Whatever form this something takes, it needs to violate the expectations and normal or conventional ways of being and thinking that exist within that world. For instance, an alien that crash lands on Earth and then proceeds to make copies of itself by infecting all biological life with fragments of its DNA. That would violate the expectation that other beings in the world are who we think they are. It also violates our conventional knowledge concerning how DNA replication and reproduction work. An infestation of enormous, venomous, carnivorous millipedes, the size and shape and speed of buses, would completely destroy our understanding of biological size, especially for insects. It would also shatter and invert the conventional relationship that we normally have with the insect world, with humans suddenly the ones underfoot in a much larger, of the much larger, more deadly millipedes. A serial killer who removes the eyes of his victims and sews them onto his body so that he can supposedly see God would violate how we believe the human mind normally works. A ghostly apparition who electrocutes all who enter its former home would violate our belief that the past is gone from our lives and that the dead cannot affect the living, at least not in any physical way. An unknown fog that appears and disappears at random and strips the flesh from all those it touches would violate our understanding of how weather works and what a fog is. And on and on and on and on and on. I could list examples here. Scary stories really are only as limited as the variety of conventions and norms that they can undermine. So this element of violation, of disruption, is the one piece of a scary story that absolutely cannot be missing. Without the reversal or outright destruction of convention and normalcy, without that shattering of our safety and our understanding of the world and our way of living, we really won't feel fear at even the most extreme violence. Example, a war with horrifying human rights atrocities fought halfway across the world will cause most people to shake their heads in consternation, feel sadness, feel hopelessness, but it probably won't make them feel fear unless they know someone involved in the conflict. unless it stands a direct threat to their personal bubble of existence, their normal way of living. In that case, with, say, a loved one involved in that fighting, that war will most likely still not even then be viewed as a scary thing, as long as the media has covered it in depth, as long as the government has sanctioned or at least acknowledged its existence, and the violence has been mediated to everyone as something normal, something understandable, something that we as people can control on some level. Rather, that violence, that loss of life, those horrible atrocities will be called tragedies, and they will be swept into the realm of the normal and no doubt horrible, but not scary, everyday living. So scary stories, horror stories, therefore, require an element of true violation to be scary. So start there. Create a nice little world, model it after our own, and introduce into it a monster or a force or something that breaks the foundational normalcy of that world. Okay, step one. What then? Surely this one idea of a disruptive force cannot be the whole of telling a scary story. No, of course not. It's the main course, but we need plenty of spices to flavor it. We need plenty of garnishes to make it a satisfying meal for the mind. Plot and the events of a story are one of the most obvious places to add some of these flavors. The plot of a scary story usually involves some aspect of mystery. When you have a monster or a destructive force in a scary story, at first it's often unclear what this monster or force is, where it's come from, and what its intentions or goals might be. It is steeped in mystery and uncertainty. A famous horror author once said that the greatest fear of mankind was fear of the unknown. So it makes a great deal of sense for monsters and disruptive elements of scary stories to be wrapped up in the unknown. It makes them all that much more frightening. But what this also means is that the plot of many a good horror story is really just a series of events that lead to the unraveling of the mystery surrounding that monster or destructive force. By gradually revealing the nature and the origins of this disruptive element, you create suspense and tension, because the disruptive force continues destroying and killing. But simultaneously, you provide the audience with progressive relief from their terror, because you provide them with understanding, with knowledge. Essentially what I'm saying is, have your plot for a scary story be a dangerous quest for answers, wherein the characters go here and there in search of more knowledge about the monster or the destructive thing. Have them uncover the truth about the monster, its nature, its origins, presumably how to beat it. This series of revelations that leads to the story's conclusion are all in service of learning about the disruptive element, making it known rather than unknown so that it can be defeated. After all, the only way to defeat something is to know how to defeat it. And the only way that you can know how to defeat it is if you know what it is in the first place. You don't want to dump all that knowledge, though, on the reader at once. Instead, pace your events in the story, dole out tidbits of valuable information about that disruptive force gradually. In this way, through a slowly unfolding understanding of the monster or destructive force, the disruption to that world can be put to an end and the readers will feel ultimate relief at the close of the story. In essence then, if you want to give readers reassurance and a little bit of uplift at the end of a scary story, basically if you want to write like Stephen King, you need to write a scary story as a mystery that's resolved, as a tale of a creepy monster or a creepy thing that through our gradual application of understanding and knowledge becomes less and less frightening, less and less able to disturb our universe and our lives, and more able for us to defeat it, which we do in the end. That's a nice closed, complete ending. If, however, you choose to really scare your audience, you want to leave them constantly looking over their shoulders, then you don't want to reveal too much of that mystery. Your plot elements can lead characters through a search for answers, yes, but the answers they obtain should only be partial answers. Or maybe the answers they find don't really even help in defeating this disruptive and destructive force at all. Knowledge itself in this case would be useless. In either of those cases, the disruptive element of the story cannot be defeated through any understanding or intentional action of other characters. It remains active and destructive to the very end of the story, and becomes a disturbing, possibly permanent part of that world within the story. It's always crouching nearer and nearer, with no one ever sure when or where it's going to strike again. This kind of plot, with the lack of a clear defeat for the disruptive element and an ambiguous future for the characters and the world in general, is the kind that will ultimately polarize audiences. It's going to polarize readers. Some readers will hate it. Many will hate it, because they will say that the story, quote unquote, doesn't have an ending. What they want is for that disruption to be conquered. They want to feel safe and know that monsters or destructive forces that cannot be beaten simply don't exist. But when you leave the disruptive force in play, when you allow the monster to continue disrupting, which usually means killing or destroying or changing the world in a way people don't like, then what you're implying is that the characters of the story, and by extension your readers, are not, and maybe can never be, in control of this situation. You're showing readers that scary things do exist in the world, and sometimes they simply cannot be wiped away. This kind of unsettling, ambiguous ending will probably not make you popular in the mainstream. But critics do love it. So take heart. So there you have some plot tips, some plot pointers. Okay. So monsters, disruptive element, good. Plot, good. Is there anything else? Yep. Atmosphere, setting. Atmosphere and setting are pretty important to scary stories. There's a reason so many horror movies begin at night in the middle of a thunderstorm. Cliche, right? But there's a reason. It's eerie. There's a power far beyond human control in a thunderstorm, and there's a complete unknown in what lurks out there in the darkness of a moonless night. It all makes us feel small and weak and very open to attack from some sort of destructive force. This is why scary movies love to start in deep, lonely woods, or in the vast open ocean, or in the overwhelming, empty expanse of space. These settings, with their natural atmospheres, prime us to accept that there's going to be a thing in this story that cannot be easily mastered. A thing similar to a raging thunderstorm, an enormous ocean, or the seemingly infinite depths of outer space. They put readers in the right frame of mind. You don't have to set a story in any of these types of locales to create an effective, scary story, but it does help. To this end of creating a setting, an atmosphere that accentuates the sense of fear that a scary story tries to convey, you'll want to choose maybe one of a few tried and true backgrounds. As I mentioned, wildernesses far away from civilization, the open ocean, outer space, they're all good for instilling in readers a feeling that they're insignificant, that ultimately they have little power over the world. These settings also allow for a feeling of isolation, of being far from any meaningful aid or any meaningful rescue, and therefore grip the reader with a certain sense of helplessness. Abandoned or nearly abandoned places are also excellent fodder for settings for scary stories. Old houses and barns, ancient ruins, dilapidated and rundown urban areas, sparsely populated small towns, vacant buildings, they're all able to convey a certain loneliness, as though entering these places cuts one off from the rest of the world and the rest of humanity, and leaves you open to potential attack. Abandoned places force two questions into a reader's mind. First, why was this place abandoned? And hint, it probably wasn't a nice, happy reason. Second, what still might remain in this abandoned place, or seemingly abandoned place? And again, probably some sort of monster or disruptive force. In either case, setting a scary story in an abandoned location already begins the work of laying down your plot, as the monster or destructive force is almost certainly tied to that location in some way, and therefore one of the elements of the mystery concerning that force's nature and origin has already been partially developed simply through your setting. When thinking about atmosphere and horror, night is also usually better than day, because night hides monsters and makes them all the more unknown and therefore fearful. However, when daytime is used in horror, it's often even more frightening than night, because we expect a certain safety in daytime hours. We don't assume that a monster will just come creeping down the street at noon when it could wait until midnight. So when it does, it's all that more shocking. It's all that more unsettling. Because it's out of what we normally think of as its domain, which would be night. The same logic applies to weather. Thunderstorms, heavy rain, heavy snow, fog, they're all harbingers of the spooky and the terrifying. These forms of weather do what? They conceal. They hide potential horrors from our view, or at least they make those horrors harder to see, which amplifies that feeling of anxiety or tension that a scary story is trying to convey. We even call weather, probably never thought about this, but we even call weather bad or good, based on the factors of whether they can conceal or not. That we have proper normal weather and terrible abnormal weather says something about how we look at norms concerning weather. So of course, the monstrous is going to be aligned with bad weather. But just as a monster in full day is more unsettling than a monster at night, so too is a monster in clear, bright weather going to be more unsettling than a monster wrapped in storms and mist. It stepped out of its supposed habitat into peaceful rays of sunshine, which by our conventional thinking simply aren't supposed to allow a monster to exist in their midst. Now, although what I've mentioned so far stands as general rules when it comes to atmosphere and setting, really, any atmosphere or setting can be effective for a scary story, depending on what your story involves. For example, a story about a viral infection that mutates its victims into hideous monsters, that would probably be more effective at scaring readers if it's set inside a densely populated city. Why? Because the danger posed by the virus will be greater and more extreme. Likewise, a story about a carnivorous alien flower that arrived from seeds in the tail of a comet could be set in a beautiful botanical garden for its greatest impact, rather than out in the middle of a dark, deep glade in the forest. What I'm saying is this: a horror story doesn't have to be set in a dark and stormy place. Rather, let your particular disruptive element, your monster, your destructive thing, guide you to figure out what would create the most tension, the highest anxiety, and the deepest fear surrounding that thing. Okay, so almost done here. We've almost reached the end. We've covered atmosphere and setting, plot, the disruptive force. What's left? Characters. Characters in scary stories who aren't monsters, are usually forgotten. Think about famous movie monsters. Name for me any of the teenagers who have beaten Freddy Krueger. How about the names of the two people who have temporarily killed Jason Voorhees? What's the name of the sheriff that blew up the shark in Jaws? Who killed Dracula other than Abraham Van Helsing? Can you even tell me the name of the first name of the main non-monster character in the last scary movie that you saw? Probably not. Unless you're a horror aficionado or have a good memory, you probably don't recall these details. Why? Because we focus most of our attention on the disruptive element, which is the monster or the destructive force. In general, that's the thing we remember from scary stories and horror, not the people who fight it. Maybe we just like destruction and violence, at least in our art. And so it's the author of that destruction and violence, the monster, that imprints most vividly on our memories. Maybe non-monster characters in scary stories are simply not that important. Or maybe non-monsters are usually not very well written. Whatever the case, characters in horror are quite frequently overlooked and forgotten. The question is, should this be the case? Do scary stories need us to forget the non-monster characters? And if so, what should characters be like in horror? There are two schools of thought on this issue. One is that characters should always be well developed and three-dimensional. They should sound like real people in the world around you. They should act like real people would act. They should have thoughts and aspirations and motivations just like all the people you know. Think about your friends, your family. Think about the people you've met and people you know through the news like celebrities and politicians. And model your characters when you tell a scary story after them. Ask yourself what a person would do and say in a situation within your story, and then have your character do and say that realistic thing. Much contemporary horror fiction, both literature and movies, has been moving in this direction of more fully fleshed out characters. The non-monster characters in scary stories are really as complex right now as they've ever been, as much like you or your friends or your family as they possibly can be. This is good because it makes the horrors that befall them ultimately all that much more realistic and meaningful. It also allows readers to connect with the characters more fully and thereby become more invested in the story. It draws people in, mentally and emotionally. But here's the thing about scary stories. bad stuff is going to happen to those wonderful characters. And if you're the writer, you've got to make that happen. If you're telling the scary story, it's your job to torture or kill your beloved characters. Sometimes that's hard as a writer, and sometimes readers will be angry that you did it. But as I said, we're talking horror here. We're talking scary stories. And a story will not scare you if nothing bad happens to someone in that story. At least as long as nothing is implied even that anything bad will happen to your characters in the story. So, your nice, well-rounded creations usually have to be horror. That's just the price that you pay for writing horror. You create a wonderful person, and then you destroy them. Now, if taking that time to create a three-dimensional character only to tear them apart later doesn't really appeal to you, there's a second school of thought on characters in scary stories. That they're basically functionaries. What I mean here is that the non-monster characters, they only exist within horror to serve as victims. You might give them a little personality, maybe a quirky name, maybe a couple notable characteristics that we're supposed to define them by, but as a whole, they're not as well developed as characters in mainstream non-horror literature. You might ask, why would I ever want to do that? Why would I intentionally make my story weaker with regard to character? Well, there are a couple reasons. First, you might want to focus your reader on that monstrous thing, that disruptive element in your story. Maybe you're trying to make some big point about a great evil within our society, and so you decided to turn it into a metaphorical monster and have it rampage through hundreds or thousands of victims, leaving carnage and blood in its wake. This is often the case for stories about like kaiju and other monsters of enormous size and incomprehensible power. Maybe you're trying to represent society as a whole through your victims, your non-monster characters. In this case, it might make more sense for your characters to be relative anybody's without well-defined characteristics. They can be anyone and everyone. Maybe you're trying to bring the readers into the story as themselves. I just read to you a second-person story. You were in my story. Then you narrate the story not with an eye toward any one particular individual, but with the hope of lacing enough general traits and qualities into your character to allow the reader to see themselves broadly in that character. There are a lot of reasons why, for any particular story, you might want to represent non-monster characters as less than well-defined. This doesn't mean, though, that you should always write stock, hollow, generalized characters. Only on the occasion that you realize that a scary story calls for victims to just be victims and little more, should you really tread that path. And even then, do it carefully. When you don't have solid characters, something else in your story needs to reach out and really capture the reader's attention. So either your monster needs to be more interesting and more developed, or your plot needs to be more engaging and thought-provoking, or your setting needs to be very dynamic and almost a character unto itself. One way or the other, something needs to make up for the lack of a substantial character. Bottom line, characters are important, but characters can be developed in a couple different ways. So there you have it. The foundational pieces for a scary story. Disruptive element, like a monster. A plot that involves the progressive solving of some sort of mystery. A setting and atmosphere conducive to fear. And characters that are either nicely well developed and round or one-dimensional for a particular effect. When you put all those pieces together, you'll have something approaching a scary story. Not every scary story will grip the reader, because everyone holds different fears and anxieties and traumas. But if you keep writing, you keep inventing new monsters, new characters, new plots, new settings, then you're bound to find in time something that really does make everyone shiver a little bit. And that, as a scary storyteller, is really the only goal. So, there you have it. We'll try some
About 10
questions.
minutes for questions.
Yeah, questions, yeah, sure. Questions. Yes?
To what extent are you influenced by the work of H.P. Lovecraft?
I used to be much more influenced by him when I was starting out. I don't want to say how long ago, but like 15 years ago. I was much more influenced by him then. I really like his overly flowery prose, and the idea of cosmic horror is something that appeals to me a lot, of the inconsequentiality of just the human endeavor. That really appeals to me on some level. So yeah, I used to be much more influenced by him. Now my writing, I'd say, yeah, I still have some cosmic horror flares here and there, but that florid writing, I've kind of tried to get away from that a little bit, and of course H.P. Lovecraft has lots and lots of problems beyond that with the horrible issues with race and misogyny that exist within his work. So yeah, it's good to take him with a grain of salt at times.
So I'm thinking of some shows that my husband and I are watching because we like to spend October doing scary, you know.
Yeah, we do too.
And don't you think that it kind of ruins it? I like what you had to say about character. That was really interesting. When the characters are so one-dimensional that they're just stupid. Like, we just watched the show Midnight Mass, but I'm sorry if everybody else liked it. We did not, because the characters were so stupid that they couldn't figure out that the whole island was becoming, I'm gonna ruin it, vampires. And so it's like, well, then it kind of ruins the horror effect. You know, and like with Friday the 13th, it's like, oh, well, she deserved that because she ran toward the noise of the chainsaw. You know what I mean? It's like, it's interesting what you said about, like, do you find that when you're watching horror that some of these people are just so vacuous and one-dimensional that they're just stupid?
I find that that's the case sometimes. I always try to temper my expectations of characters because, you know, that's a criticism that gets leveled at horror a lot, is that, oh, the characters did something so stupid. But I always try to come back and think, okay, in a situation where, you know, you are under some sort of duress or fear, how would people really react? And I think a lot of people would have stupid reactions. I mean, all you need to do is look around our society right now and see people have stupid reactions to things. So I always think, like, you know, are those actions really all that crazy? Are they really all that dumb? Are they really all that not realistic? And that's really what it comes down to for me. It can be stupid,
Yeah.
as long as it's realistic. If it's not realistic, then all right, then we're not even in the realm of horror anymore. We're in the realm of some kind of like bizarro fiction. I don't know.
Yeah.
But as long as it's realistic for me, people can be stupid. It's annoying sometimes, yes, absolutely. But that doesn't necessarily take me out of a story. Yeah.
Why do you write horror?
Why do I write horror? I have no idea. I have no idea. It's what I've always been drawn to. The very first story I wrote when I was little was kind of a horror story. When I was a teenager and just kind of practicing, trying to become something, trying to find my voice, I wrote fantasy and horror. It's just always what I've been drawn to. I think maybe it's because I find our own world distressingly banal and tedious in a lot of ways. And I wish evil was more obvious, and I wish evil was more in our face and grandiose. but often evil comes in the form of some little person in a suit. I don't mean little person like little person, I mean like their soul is little. I mean like a person is, like a terrible politician person. Little person in a suit comes along, and that's really the embodiment of evil. And I wish it was a monster. I wish it was a monster. I think that's part of it. I also wish things were more fantastical in our world than perhaps they are sometimes. So I think that's what draws me. So
I know Stephen King says that he doesn't sleep with his leg hanging over the bed. Do you scare yourself?
No. No, I have never. I know a lot of writers do say that. Oh, no, when I wrote this story, I really scared myself. I've never scared myself writing something. I am incredibly hard to scare when it comes to movies or books or any kind of media. The only thing that sometimes gets me is video games. A horror video game, maybe because it's really interactive. And even then, it's hard to really scare me with any of this kind of art horror stuff.
To Karen's point, I just finished reading a couple months ago On Writing by Stephen King, and I found it fabulous. I loved it. And so this question's about perhaps your writing process. I know you don't scare easily, but I picture you, when you go sit down to write, do you set a mood, like it was a dark and stormy night, do you light a candle? No, because I don't mean to be funny about it, but how do you, if you're moving into another world and you're creating things that are irreal, how do you get there? I mean, your process of that.
I mean, I hate to say it, but a lot of ideas just kind of they just kind of pop up like divine madness. I'll be teaching a class and I'll say something and I'll be like, that's an interesting idea that I just, and immediately after class, gotta take out my phone, gotta write something down. I'll be sitting here in the writing center between appointments and I gotta type something up here something just hit me. When I actually do most of my actual grinding away at the stories and developing them, that tends to be pretty late at night. Most horror authors that I know either write really late at night or really early in the morning. I guess that maybe is just a function of most horror authors like the darkness to set the mood. It does. It helps, I think, in some way. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So how did you start off as a novelist? What was your first book that you did?
How did I start off? Like I said, I wrote my first short story when I was like 10 years old. Then as a teenager, I wrote for a while. I had some creative writing classes in college. I took a couple screenwriting classes, that sort of thing. But I really, honestly, did not really have anybody in my life that really supported me with my writing. And so I pretty much gave it up for a while. After college, I still wrote because I can't not write. I just can't. I can't not write. So I still wrote, but I didn't even try to get anything published. I didn't try to do anything. And that went on until I went to grad school for English. And in grad school, in my mid-20s, late 20s, I had a professor who was teaching a class on zombies in literature. And she decided she wanted to be an editor. And so she said, I'm going to edit a book of zombie stories. And she knew that I was interested in that kind of stuff. And she said, do you write? And I was like, yes, I do actually write. She's like, you want to write a story for this book? And I said, yeah, okay, I'll write a story for this book. And I wrote a story for that book, and she took it and she published it. And that same story I took and I revised it a little bit, and I published it a year later in a big magazine called Weird Tales, which used to exist, doesn't exist anymore. Well, they actually do exist, they hadn't existed for a long time. But anyway, they're like a super, super old famous magazine where horror writers used to get published in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And they took my weird zombie story, because it's not just a zombie story, it's a weird zombie story. And from there on, I just started cranking out stories and got them published, and when I had enough of them that I thought I had a decent collection together, put them together in a collection, sent it off to a publisher. They took it, they published it, and then after that, people just kind of started coming, reading my writing, and then I started getting nominated for awards, started winning them, and published a second one, and then this is the third one that comes out later this year. This is an advanced reading copy, so it's not really the real thing, but, so yeah, that's how I got started. Kind of a process.
What method do you use for outlining your stories?
Some people would kill me for saying this, but there are two strains of writer. One of them is a plotter, and one of them is a by the pantser. I am by the pants. I really do not plot. There are two things that I try to have when I sit down for a story. I try to have a nice opening, and I try to know where the end is gonna be. Ray Bradbury said something about this. He said something like, you figure out what your ending is, and then you run toward it as fast as you can. That's kind of, I think that's great advice.
That's really good advice.
Again, that's what I try to do. I try to figure out what my beginning is, set it up, and then figure out what my ending is, and then whatever happens in between happens. And so, yeah, I don't really do a whole lot of outlining or plotting along the way, which means that I do have to do a lot of editing after the fact, but again, that's part of writing. So. Yeah.
How do you know how much, how do you know when you've used enough words to describe a scene?
Oh, you never know. You never know.
Okay.
Even now, as I was standing up here reading from that story that I read to you from, I was sitting here like, oh, right there's a thing that I could change. I went over like a sentence and I'd be like, no. And actually, as I was reading, I changed a couple sentences from what's in the book to what you heard. So you never know.
Okay.
It's constantly a process of.
Along the same line, how do you know you've described your character well enough for someone to understand or, create an image in their mind?
The only way you can know that is by getting readers, get second readers. Most of the writers I know have at least, 2 or 3 people that they run their drafts by, that they say, here, read this, tell me what you think. And getting some good readers before you send things out for publication is very valuable. Because those people, if they're good readers, they can tell you, yeah, this works, this doesn't work, here's what you need to try to change. And they won't tell you exactly how to revise your story, but they'll at least be able to put their finger on problems so that if you do have a character that like, this character doesn't make sense, or this character doesn't work, this character I didn't connect to at all, you need to do something with that character. So yeah, it's really about getting what we call beta readers. So, yeah. Yeah.
Besides horror, which other genres interest you?
Really all the speculative fiction stuff, which is fantasy, science fiction, and what has more and more popularly been called like weird fiction. Those are the things that interest me. Magical realism, stuff that takes us out of our, like I said, boring, tedious world and into something else that's just slightly removed from our own world. Yeah. And I'm all about speculative fiction stuff. I do read mainstream fiction though, I do. You can't not, I'm a professor of English, for God's sake. So yeah, but this is where my love really is. This is where my heart is, so, yeah.
How's the publication process?
How? Do you want me to describe it, or are you asking me for like
What
a?
is like the process of going to the publications, like?
Okay, depends on the publisher.
Okay.
Depends on the publisher. Some publishers are really easy to work with. Some publishers, they'll put out a call for stories and say, here, this is what we're looking for, this is how much we pay, this is how many words you have to write. Write your story, send it to them, and hopefully you'll hear back within 2-3 months. Some publishers have very vague description of what they want. You send a story to them and you won't hear back for a year. Some publishers, you'll send a story and you'll never hear from them again. And you'll just assume you got rejected. So it really depends on the publisher, like what it's like getting published and working with them. I will say that after you've been, it's hardest when you're starting out. It's absolutely hardest when you're starting out. Because nobody knows who you are. They don't know whether to think your writing is good or bad. They don't know whether you have any talent or not. And so it's really hard when you're starting out to get every publisher to respond to you, to get every publisher to send you something, saying, yes, I read your work, or at least, send you a note saying, all right, it's not for us. But as you develop as a writer, as you move on in your writing career, and again, get some publications out there, it becomes easier and easier, because then suddenly publishers know that if they never respond to you, you're probably going to put something on social media like, that publisher, maybe don't work with them. You're going to talk to other writers. You're going to talk to other people in that circle of like the horror community, and you're going to say that's somebody you don't want to work with other writers because they don't respond to you, because they don't communicate with you. So yeah, it becomes easier as you become more well known. In terms of books and publishing, that all I can say is patience. Patience, patience, patience. From the time you actually get a book together to the time when you actually see it in print, if you go through a traditional publisher, even an independent publisher, a small press publisher, even then, the turnaround is at least a year, 2 years. This collection is coming out in December. I first submitted to the publisher in, when was it? Like January of 2020. So it's been almost 2 years. It's taken.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it takes a while. It takes a while. Patience for books. And if you're talking about if you are lucky enough to get signed by one of the big publishers where they'll put your books in Barnes & Noble and then they will see if they can get you a New York Times review, that kind of publisher, then we're talking 3, 4 years, 5 years turnaround between when you submit your manuscript and you finally see that book in real life.
Mm.
So patience.
Oh, so it wouldn't be easier even if you were on a college campus and you could go through a publishing alumni? Because I know they have.
If you know people, if you can find contacts, then yes, it becomes easier. It becomes easier to get your stuff read, but that whole process of publishing, it still usually takes a while because most reputable publishers will have a backlog of stuff they have to publish. So, there's gonna be 4 other books they have to get out before yours, and one of them's coming out in June, and then they have to do all the media stuff for that. They have to get reviews, and they have to try to get other authors to say something about it, to put blurbs on it. And then another one comes out, 3 months later, and then another one comes out 3 months later, and then finally they make it to yours. So even then, it's just about working through a backlog, because there's so many books published today. There are more books published now than there have ever been, so.
Maybe one more question?
Out of the 3 rhetorical appeals, emotional, logical, and ethical, which one do you tend to focus more on or incorporate in your writing?
That's an interesting question. As a horror writer, I suppose I should try to say emotional. And I do try to do that, but one of the criticisms that people have leveled at me as a writer is that sometimes I am too, I don't want to say didactic and logical, but there's too much logic, there's too much, if you look at this book right here, it has, for instance, a story that's kind of a story. It's I overthink my stories sometimes. There's a story that's not really a story, it's actually an academic paper that's kind of a horror story about the apocalypse, but it's also about dogs. And like it's kind of like, if you think about it long enough, like, okay, you could see this as an academic paper, and you can see it as a kind of a story, but it's like almost like an intellectual exercise, and maybe you lose some of that, like, oh, it's supposed to be scary in the mix. So yeah, you know, as a horror author, I'd like to say, well, emotional, but I do a fair amount of logic and intellectual stuff in my stories too, maybe too much at times.
Kurt, would you be willing to stick around if folks have individual questions?
Sure.
Wonderful, great, let's give Kurt a hand. Thank you for coming, everyone.
If you have any questions, yeah, feel free, come on up.